Dixon, uh, about to react to the man who sold his soul to the devil. Let's do it. The old music. Wow. You just feel like, ooh. Robert Johnson. Is this him?
His name is synonymous with blues. His music made him one of the most iconic figures in his genre. He is cemented as a legend. And yet, very little is known about Robert Johnson. 29 songs, 2 verified photographs, and hundreds of unanswered questions. Johnson's life, his story, and his artistry is wrapped in mystery to this day, but his music resonates with millions. However, Johnson wasn't always a brilliant musician. In fact, he was considered to be relatively untalented, even up until his early 20s. Allegedly, he improved rapidly on the guitar, so much so that a legend was born that Johnson sold his soul to the devil so that he could become a master of the guitar. Johnson passed away under mysterious circumstances at 27 years old, giving birth to the infamous 27 Club and adding yet another question mark onto his already confusing story.
The early days.
Robert was born on the 8th of May, 1911, to parents Julia Dodds and Noah Johnson in Hazelhurst, Mississippi. His mother had already given birth to 10 kids with her husband Charles, but Robert was born out of wedlock, illegitimately, and had a father who he most likely never met or spoke to. His stepfather, Charles, was a reasonably successful landowner, but after getting into a dispute with a lynch mob, he was forced to move to Memphis, and Robert would eventually be sent there to live with him until he was around 8 or 9 years old. At that age, he moved back to Mississippi to live with his mother and her new husband, Dusty Willis. In his teenage years, Robert began to gain an interest in music and dabbled in some different aspects of it. He learned the basics of the guitar from one of his brothers, and he was cited as being a talented harmonica player. We can also assume that he was writing songs and singing during this time. But all of this wasn't very appealing to his new stepfather, who wanted him to work on the plantation fields. This would lead to a conflict between the two, and while he was still a teenager, Robert would try and find his own freedom and independence. This started when he was 19. He married a 16-year-old Virginia Travis on the 17th of February, 1929, but unfortunately, she would die a year later while giving birth. Robert was now a 20-year-old widow with a stepfather he didn't like, a father he never met, and a wife who had just passed away. And lest we forget, he was an African-American man living in the South in the early 20th century. Basically, Robert had an intense childhood, and his adult life wasn't looking very good either. At this stage, all Robert really had was his music. It was around this time that legendary blues icon Son House moved to a town that was near where Robert lived. All of a sudden, a lost and impressionable Robert Johnson was listening to one of the greatest blues artists of his generation perform live every week at the local juke joint. At this point, Robert had some musical ability, but it was mainly at the previously mentioned harmonica, so he wasn't considered talented enough to perform at these establishments, but during the breaks, Johnson would ask if he could play their guitars. In one of the most famous interviews ever given about Robert Johnson, Son House states that he was terrible and that he was often asked to stop playing.
He'd follow me and Willie around on Saturday night, Willie Brown. And every time we stopped for rest and sit at a little guitar over in the corner or something and go out to catch air, get the guitar and be trying to play it and be just noising the people, And the folks would come out and say, why don't some of y'all go and make that boy get that thing down, he's running us crazy.
Johnson may have been in the correct environment to observe the music he wanted to play, but because of his lack of resources and the ridicule he was subjected to when he attempted to perform, he was in the wrong environment to learn. This may have been the reason he left. He did remarry in 1931, but that didn't stop him from traveling around the South for about a year. This is a confusing space of time that is responsible for many of the myths revolving around Johnson. Some people speculated that he left to try and find his biological father, while others believed that he was exclusively focusing on improving his craft. But the other theory, and strangely the most popular one, is that Robert Johnson made a deal with the
How?
devil.
How can you make a deal with the devil? A deal with the devil. Let's get it.
The story goes that Robert Johnson went to a local crossroads with his guitar before midnight. He started playing his songs, and at midnight, the devil appeared. The devil took the guitar and tuned it, played a song, and gave it back to Johnson. This was the transaction, the turning point for Johnson as a musician. He had given up his soul to the devil himself and was a master of guitar. But with this, his soul was doomed to hell and an untimely demise was in his future. The reason people believe that this is what happened is because of a man named Liddell Johnson, who in 1971 said that this was the way to sell your soul and that his brother Tommy had actually done this. There was no relation between Tommy and Robert, but that didn't stop people from taking this tale and attaching it to Robert's name. At least that's how the story goes. It's obviously a far-fetched tale, but it shows us how impressive and quick Johnson's improvement must have been. The only way the public were able to justify his talents was with a story that was this insane, which in itself tells us why Robert Johnson was so good. One thing is almost certain. Between the years of 1930 and 1932, something happened that made Johnson go from being considered embarrassingly bad to one of the greatest guitarists of all time. When he finally returned to play for Son House, nobody was telling him to stop. He was so good, when he finished, all our mouths were standing open. Johnson took his new talents and began traveling with fellow artist Johnny Shines, where he improved his craft even further, but he still hadn't recorded anything and his talents were being wasted. It was the mid-1930s and his second wife had passed away. Johnson was determined to record and make a name for himself. He went into a man named H.C. Spears' store, who worked for the ARC record label. Finally, in November of 1936, Johnson was in a studio recording the first of his almost 30 songs. He would continuously return to record until the summer of 1937. He made okay money doing this and had amassed a small but loyal fan base, but Johnson wasn't a household name by any means. His music had some dark undertones. Songs like Me and the Devil Blues, If I Had Possession Over Judgment Day, Hellhound on My Trail, and of course, Crossroad Blues. Dark themes like hell, the devil, and death were prominent in his music, and this did nothing but add fuel to his already dark image. But this was par for the course for blues. These weren't new thematic explorations, they were cemented attributes of the genre, but people emphasized Johnson's dark lyrics to add to the narrative, even though there were hundreds of similar acts doing the same thing. Regardless, the recordings were done, and unfortunately, that would be Johnson's entire discography, because a year later, he would die.
Johnson's death. What happened?
On the 16th of August, 1938, Robert Johnson, aged 27, was found dead. Very little is known about the specifics of his untimely demise. In fact, the actual date he died wasn't discovered for another 30 years when music journalist Gail Dean Wardlow found his death certificate. It didn't have any cause of death, so we weren't given any answers in that department, but of course, there are theories. The first theory, which is the most plausible and the most boring, is that Robert died from untreated syphilis that he had inherited from one of his parents. It was a common problem for low-income families at the time, and it's entirely possible that Johnson was a victim of this. But if you haven't figured it out yet, nothing is ever black and white with Robert Johnson. And as you probably expected, there is a second theory that Johnson was murdered. Johnson had been performing for a few weeks at a country dance that was only 15 miles away from where he was found. Allegedly, he was flirting with a married woman at these dances. Her husband gave Robert a drink, but Sonny Boy Williamson, a fellow musician and friend of Johnson, slapped the drink out of his hand and told him that it was dangerous to accept drinks from unknown people. Johnson was angry at Williamson for doing this, and he accepted a second drink from the husband, which he did consume. Williamson wrote an account about this, and he was a well-respected figure of the blues community who had a confirmed association with Johnson, so it is entirely possible that he was telling the truth. Whether Johnson was actually poisoned is a different story altogether. However, Robert Mac McCormack, a notable blues researcher, claimed that he tracked down the man who killed Johnson and actually got a confession from him. He declined to reveal the name or release the confession, which seems like a strange thing to do. If you were a blues researcher and found out who killed one of the genre's biggest icons, it's very strange that you wouldn't release that information. But these accounts and statements have made this second theory more believable, and a lot of people do believe it to be true. Either way, the end result was the same. Johnson had passed at the young age of 27, with very few answers as to what happened, concluding his already insane life with an ending that was incredibly unfortunate and untimely, but morbidly fitting for such a mysterious and interesting character. Some of his friends, associates, and peers wouldn't find out about his death for a long time, not until they looked for him and realized through word of mouth that he was gone. It seemed as if Johnson would fade into obscurity. For 2 decades after his death, he remained a relatively unknown figure in the music world, but in 1961, Columbia Records released the album King of the Delta Blues Singers, a compilation of Johnson's work that would achieve immense success and bring his music to a wider audience. It was widely considered to be one of the greatest albums of all time, and it solidified Johnson as a blues legend. He was finally recognized, and while he wasn't able to enjoy the fruits of his labor, the world could enjoy his work and admire his greatness. His dream of becoming one of the greatest blues artists of all time was finally realized. Robert Johnson probably didn't sell his soul to the devil, but he did give his soul to blues. It could be argued that what Johnson managed to do in his short life was one of the greatest feats ever achieved by a musician. His short discography changed blues forever and influenced hundreds of notable musicians and continues to do so to this day. He won a Grammy in 1990 for Best Historical Album, his song Crossroads Blues was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame 8 years later, and he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1986. He has been cited as an influence to artists like Mick Jagger, Fleetwood Mac, Bob Dylan, and Eric Clapton. He did all of this in a very short span of time, with a life that was as difficult as any. He overcame it all and persevered to become one of music's most important icons. It's very difficult to distinguish fact from fiction when it comes to this man. The historical inaccuracies, conspiracy theories, and sheer lack of any substantial documentation make his story a confusing one, but one thing is for certain: Robert Johnson was a legend.
At the age of 27, but his death is like, but I'll actually believe the second one. Maybe he was poisoned with the unknown guy who was giving him the drink. All right, thank you guys for watching. Hope you learned something and enjoyed the video as I did. See you next time. Peace.